Hey, how's it going? So you find me in Edinburgh today, right outside St Giles Cathedral. Now this cathedral was originally constructed in the middle of the 12th century. It was consecrated in the middle of the 13th century, around about 1243. Dedicated to St Giles, named after St Giles. St Giles was a chap from Athens. He became a hermit living in Nîmes, France, a place I'm very, very fond of. Nîmes, if you haven't been there, is in the southern France. Still home to bullfighting, sadly. Other than that, it's a wonderful, wonderful place to visit. Giles used to live in the forest around Nîmes, and there he used to protect the wild deer, the animals, and his only friends were the animals. It is said that he basically protected one of the deer when a huntsman came hunting, fired the arrow, he caught the arrow in his hand, it went straight through his hand, saving the deer, but obviously maiming himself. This cathedral started off as a Catholic cathedral, but due to the Reformation which happened in the 16th century under the watch of John Knox, who was preaching for the Reformation even while Mary Queen of Scots was ruling over Edinburgh, John Knox reformed this church and it became a Protestant church, and it's evolved a lot over the centuries. Let's go and have a look inside because this is a wonderful, wonderful church.
Welcome to St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, or also known as the High Kirk of Edinburgh. It's a parish church to the Church of Scotland. The Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Scotland identified St Giles as the centre focus of the Old Town. The church fortunately occupies a prominent and flat portion of the ridge that leads down to Edinburgh Castle. It sits on the south side of the High Street, the main street of the Old Town, and one of the streets that make up the very famous Royal Mile. From its initial construction in the 12th century until the 14th century, St Giles was located near the eastern edge of Edinburgh. By the time of construction of the King's Wall in the mid-15th century, the burh had expanded and St Giles stood near its central point. In the late medieval and early modern periods, St Giles was located at the centre of Edinburgh's civic life. St Giles sits on the north side of Parliament Square, with the law courts on the south side of the square. The area immediately south of the church was originally the kirkyard, which stretched downhill to the Cowgate. For more than 450 years, St Giles served as a parish burial ground. This was closed to burials in 1561 and handed over to the town council in 1566.
Robert Louis Stevenson.
I have to say I'm very fond of this large bronze relief of Robert Louis Stevenson. Robert Louis Stevenson, born Robert Louis Balfour Stevenson, was a Scottish novelist, essayist, poet, and to my heart, he was also a travel writer. However, he was best known for his work such as Treasure Island, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Kidnapped, and A Child's Garden of Verses. My personal favourite is Treasure Island. If you haven't read that book, it is a beautiful, beautiful book. The cathedral is of course named after St Giles. St Giles is the patron saint of lepers. Though chiefly associated with the Abbey of St Giles in modern-day France, he was a popular saint in medieval Great Britain. The church was first possessed by monks of the Order of St Lazarus, who ministered among lepers. The church was likely founded in the 12th century and dedicated to St Giles. The church was elevated to collegiate status by Pope Paul II in 1467. In 1559, the church became Protestant, with John Knox, the foremost figure of the Scottish Reformation, as its minister. I'll talk a little bit more about the Reformation later. After the Reformation, St Giles was internally partitioned to serve multiple congregations as well as for secular purposes, such as a prison and a meeting place for the Parliament of Scotland. In 1633, Charles I made St Giles the cathedral of the newly created Diocese of Edinburgh. Charles attempted to impose a Scottish prayer book in 1637, which caused a riot which precipitated the formation of the Covenanters and the beginning of the War of the Three Kingdoms. The Church's role in the Scottish Reformation and the Covenanters' rebellion has led to it being called the Mother Church of the world of Presbyterianism. St Giles is one of Scotland's most important medieval parish church buildings. The first church of St Giles was a small Romanesque building of which only fragments now remain. In the 14th century, this was replaced by the current building, which was enlarged between the late 14th and early 16th centuries. The The church was altered between 1829 and 1833 by William Byrne and restored between 1872 and 1883 by William Hay with the support of William Chambers. Chambers hoped to make St Giles a Westminster Abbey for Scotland by enriching the church and adding memorials to the notable Scots. Between 1909 and 1911, the Thistle Chapel, designed by Robert Lorimer, was added to the church. Since the medieval period, St Giles has been the site of nationally important events and services. The services of the Order of the Thistle take place here, alongside housing a very active congregation. The church is one of Scotland's most popular visitor sites. It attracted over 1 million visitors pre-COVID in 2018. At the beginning of 1559, with the Scottish Reformation gaining ground, the town's council hired soldiers to defend St Giles from the reformers. The council also distributed the church treasures amongst trusted townsmen for safekeeping. At 3 p.m. on the 29th of June 1559, the army of the Lords of the Congregation entered Edinburgh unopposed that afternoon. John Knox, the foremost figure of the Reformation in Scotland, had just preached in St Giles. The following week, Knox was elected minister of St Giles, and a week after that, the purging of the church's Roman Catholic furnishings began. Mary of Guise, who was then ruling as regent for her daughter Mary Queen of Scots, offered Holyrood Abbey as the place of worship for those who wished to remain in the Roman Catholic faith, while St Giles served the Edinburgh Protestants. Mary of Guise also offered the Lords of the Congregation that the parish church in Edinburgh would, after the 10th of January 1560, remain in whichever confession proved the most popular among the burgh's inhabitants. These proposals came to nothing, and the Lords of the Congregation signed a truce with the Roman Catholic forces and vacated Edinburgh. John Knox, fearing for his life, left the city on the 24th of July 1559. St Giles, however, remained in Protestant hands. With Knox gone, John Wilcock continued to preach as French soldiers disrupted his sermons, and ladders to be used in the Siege of Leith were constructed in the church. The events of the Scottish Reformation thereafter briefly turned in favour of the Roman Catholic party. They retook Edinburgh, and the French agent Nicolas de Pavel, Bishop of Amiens, reconsecrated St Giles as a Roman Catholic church on the 9th of November 1559. After the Treaty of Berwick secured the intervention of Elizabeth I of England on the side of the reformers, they retook Edinburgh. St Giles once again became a Protestant church on the 1st of April 1560.
John Knox.
Knox returned to Edinburgh on the 23rd of April 1560. The Parliament of Scotland legislated that from the 24th of August 1560, the Pope had no authority in Scotland. Workmen, assisted by sailors from the port of Leith, took 9 days to clear stone altars and monuments from the church. Precious items used in the pre-Reformation worship were sold. The church was whitewashed, its pillars painted green, and the Ten Commandments and the Lord's Prayer painted on the walls. Seating was installed likely at the eastern side of the crossing. In 1561, the kirkyard at the south of the church was closed, and the most subsequent burials were conducted at Greyfriars Kirkyard. In 1567, Mary Queen of Scots was deposed and succeeded by her infant son, James VI. St Giles was a focal point of the ensuing Marian Civil War. After his assassination in January 1570, the Regent Moray, a leading opponent of Mary Queen of Scots, was interred within the church. John Knox preached at that event. Edinburgh briefly fell to Mary's forces, and in June and July in 1572, William Kirkcaldy of the Grange stationed soldiers and the cannon in the tower. Although his colleagues of 9 years, John Craig, had remained in Edinburgh during these events, Knox, with his health failing, had retired to St Andrews. A deputation from Edinburgh recalled him to St Giles, and there he preached his final sermon on the 9th of November 1572. Knox died later that month and was buried in the kirkyard in the presence of the Regent Morton. After the Reformation, parts of St Giles were given over to secular purposes. As you can see, this church has had a very, very colourful history. I could go on and tell you about how the Maiden was an early form of the guillotine was stored in the church. I could tell you about James VI. I could tell you about the preceding years that followed the Reformation, but I think it is up for you to look into. It really is a cathedral of wonder, a cathedral of much history, a cathedral of beauty, and a cathedral that means so much to the Scots and the people of Edinburgh, and a cathedral that was monumental in changing the course of the history of the British Isles.
Well, there you go. There was St Giles Cathedral. If you like this content, there's plenty more content like this. I've made many other videos on the numerous churches and cathedrals that we see around the world, but also content on politics, content on travel. Check it out. Click the subscribe button and check out my next video.